Okay, you've been waiting for this. We're celebrating Epiphany today. And some of you know what Epiphany means. Yeah, I saw a meme this week where it was probably on Facebook. Maybe it was, I didn't look at Instagram at all this week, so except for my kids. Usually I'm an Instagram hit and run guy. I'm only subscribed to my kids. I get in, see if they posted anything, and get out as quick as I can, and consider it a good day when I get out quick, because it's one of those black holes, okay, that you can get sucked into. There's only so many cat videos you can watch, especially the AI ones where they're playing instruments on the porch at 2 a.m. Okay, it's like, or they're shooting a gun at 2 a.m. Oh, those nasty little cats. Okay, so anyway, they're in Bradley fighting vehicles. I mean, it's amazing what can happen. Some of you are saying, oh, I need to get on Instagram more often. Anyway, so whatever I was saying. Anyway, we're at Epiphany, but one of the memes I saw this week was a lady who was speaking proper British saying, the Christmas decorations do not come down till Epiphany. We must be proper about this. And I thought, yeah, now Epiphany's the 6th, so we're a little early, but this is as close as we can get. What's Epiphany? Well, Epiphany is a precursor of the gospel to the Gentiles. And it's called Gentile Christmas because of the fact that the Magi who showed up were the first Gentiles that were honoring the newborn king. And that is pretty powerful when you think about it, which is why it has always been a celebration in the church, and why it's you understand where the song The 12 Days of Christmas came from? Between Christmas and Epiphany. Okay, and so we, of course, rigorously uphold the historical accuracy of our nativity scenes. Before Epiphany, it's the shepherds and Mary and Joseph and the baby Jesus over in the manger stable, okay? And then this house is just sitting there empty. So, I mean, this isn't exactly historically accurate because Jesus is still a baby. And more than likely, Jesus was a little toddler by the time the Magi showed up, because it's quite a trip to get from where they were to where, Mary and Joseph were. But we don't even, where did we hide the shepherds? They're hidden around the back. They're hiding in the stable. So, okay. But now we've just got the Magi and Mary and Joseph. Did they have camels? Probably not. They weren't a caravan. They probably had horses, but it's close enough. Were there only 3 of them? Well, there were 3 gifts, but that's a huge assumption that Persian kingmakers would come. That's who they were. Would come with only 3 of them and not a major retinue. So, but this at least gets to the place where they were at a house. So we're going to talk about that today. We're studying Matthew chapter 2, and we're going to see some things. I like to review the Magi every once in a while, just so we remember, because what happened around this time was incredible. Now, the first thing you do when you start to study the Magi, the question of, in Matthew chapter 2 at least, the first thing that you start to deal with is, what was the time frame? And when was King Herod king? And all of those things. So we'll get into some of that today. But what we're going to talk about is acknowledging the king. Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, because that's what the Magi were there for. They were there to acknowledge the King of Kings had been born into the world. And they thought it was so important that they traveled for up to a year to get there. Maybe only 6 months, but it takes a while to put your journey together and, get moving. And so they showed up and sent a message through scriptures to the rest of the world about how important Jesus is. So, acknowledging the king. We'll get right into it. Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 2. It says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, notably, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem asking, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him. Okay, this is our introduction to the Magi. And it says it was after Jesus was born. Matthew doesn't tell us how long it was. I can tell you for certain, without any doubt, it was after 40 days, the days of the purification of Mary and all of the things and rituals that had to be done after a birth. So it was certainly because there would have been no public receiving of anybody. And but more than likely, like I said, especially based upon what Herod would later do, that he would have all the boys in Bethlehem killed who were 2 years and under. It tells you that and of course he would have planned for a wide margin to make sure that the child was covered, but you got to assume Jesus as a toddler by the time the Magi show up. And they're living in a house, which is very clear, which we'll get to in a minute. Okay, let's talk about King Herod for a minute. King Herod took the throne of Israel in 40 BC. He was appointed king, and he took the throne of Israel, or he began the king of Israel. He had to drive the Parthians out. It wasn't like, hey, you're king, now it's yours. You can just go there and take. No, he had to drive out the Parthians who had come in. The Parthians were the ones there was the Medes and the Persians and then the Parthians, okay? That's shortening everything up. But they were the descendants. They were the ones who were replacing the Medes and the Persians, the Babylonians. And so they, of course, would, they could easily keep coming. Remember, Babylon came all the way over and took over the entire world, all the way down to Egypt. And in the time of the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. So they've always had influence in that area, and they always wanted to continue to have influence in that area. And so they were having influence. And so when Herod came in, he had to drive them out. So he already knew who the Parthians were, who they were, and that they were his enemies. They had an uneasy truce, I'm certain, as things were going, but you can believe we're going to see by the end of the day that there's a picture of where all the fortresses are that Herod had set up in the land of Israel. And as you look at the distribution of fortresses, you're going to realize, he had Parthians on the mind. So there's virtually nothing to the west, because that was Roman territory. But to the east, that was Parthian territory, and that's what he was concerned about. There is a discrepancy. There's a discussion about exactly when Herod died. If you look it up in an encyclopedia, what's that again? An encyclopedia. It's actually AI in written form, but you have to do it yourself. You have to kind of dig through it. But if you look online, or you do, whatever you do to find out about King Herod, you'll find out he was appointed king. There's some discrepancy about when he died. One of the general view is he died in 4 BC, which would put him, it would work inconveniently for Jesus being born in 3 BC. If Herod died in 4 BC, it means Jesus would have had to be born in about 5 BC, which just doesn't work for the time frames. It just doesn't work. But the 4 BC date is really built upon one guy's, in the early years, of the first millennia, his work, and they think he's off by about 4 years. For other reasons, they think he's off by about 4 years. So although he said that Herod was born or died in 4 BC, more than likely it was 1 BC or the turn of the century itself that year. So what we call 1 AD, because there was no 0. Okay. So, by the way, when people figure out dates from the, BC before Christ to AD, Anno Domini, after or in the year of our Lord, they often mess up their calculations because they forget there was no 0 year. Okay, it went from 1 to 1. And obviously they didn't do that, but we did that later on. Okay, so King Herod, nasty man. As he got older, he's actually started out as a very good king. He was a builder, and he watched over his people, and then he got more and more paranoid. He killed his favorite wife. He killed some kids, his own children, because he got more and more paranoid. Augustus said about him that He treated his pigs better than his family? Seriously. I mean, Caesar said that about Herod because his reputation was out there. It was safer to be, the exact quote is, it's safer to be Herod's pig than his son. Okay? Because he'd kill him. He assumed that they were going to take him out and try to take over his throne, which, by the way, Rome had to rubber stamp. You can't ever just take the throne. In fact, after Herod was gone, no one was appointed king. They all became tetrarchs. Later on, you'll see that I think it's Mark calls Herod the Tetrarch king. It's because he desperately wanted to be king, but he wasn't. And so he said, King Herod, talking about the Tetrarch. And it's ironic because he always wanted to be king, but he couldn't become king. He was only the Tetrarch. That's the one that Jesus had interchange with during his ministry. And he's called King Herod, but every time it's called King Herod, it's like tongue-in-cheek with the quotations. Everyone knew his ambition, and he never achieved it. So, but this King Herod, oh yeah, he achieved it. He was king for a long time, 40 years. And probably died in 1 BC or, just at the turn of the millennia. So we've got Herod. Now we've got the Magi, who were Parthians. What did we already hear about Parthians? Herod had to drive them out. He had fortresses set up simply because the Parthians were such a threat. That changes everything you know about the Magi. The other thing we know about the Magi is they were Parthian kingmakers. No one came to the throne in Parthia without the stamp of approval of the Magi. Now, think about that. Because what that means is that these were important officials of state in Parthia. They didn't go anywhere without having the trappings of state go with them, including cavalry and troops to protect them. And rather than camels, they would be mounted on the finest Persian steeds. And these were the guys who came tromping into Jerusalem. How do you think Herod felt about that? Hey, Herod, what's going on today? Give me some reports. Well, there's these guys, Parthians, who showed up with a squad of troops. Now, Herod had enough troops around to quell any issues. That's what wasn't the issue. The issue was as they came in, they asked this question, the Parthian kingmakers. Where is the one who has been born king of the Jews? That had to be annoying. Okay, by the way, we do know, I should also go into Jeremiah. Back when Jerusalem was destroyed in 586 BC, we read in Jeremiah, then Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, Nebuchadnezzar, the chief of the eunuchs, Nergal-Sarezer, the Rabmag, and all the chief officials of the king of Babylon sent messengers. And they were sending messengers to make sure Jeremiah was taken care of after Jerusalem fell. Okay, that's what the next verse says. However, each of these, the word captain is Rab, okay? The word chief is Rab. And then we talk about Nergal-Sarezer being the Rabmag, okay? It just means the head, the chief, and the chief of the Magi. And so it's, and they show up a lot in Daniel. Why? Generally because Daniel became the chief of the Magi, the Rabmag, okay? And we're told in Daniel 2:48, then the king placed Daniel in a high position and gave him great gifts in abundance. He made him governor over all the province of Babylon and chief official over all the wise men of Babylon. He became the Rabmag, okay? He became the guy who was over the Magi. And don't think of Magi as magicians. They were every council in that day and age always studied the stars. They were astrologers, astronomers. They were the ones who would seek out wisdom literature and find out whatever they could to be able to help and advise the king. And these were the guys that the king consulted when he wanted his dreams interpreted. Every ruler of the day, even Pharaoh, as we've already studied in the book of Genesis, had a group like this. And Daniel came to lead them. Daniel, the guy where the Lord said, hey, seal up some of the stuff that I am giving you until the appropriate time. I suspect that one of those appropriate times was at the birth of Christ, and Daniel had left information that gave the Magi the ability to spot what was going on as they read the literature he left and as they continued to study the literature of the Jewish people, because they had a high respect for it. It had proven accurate. Even Alexander the Great knew that the Jewish scriptures talked about him way before he showed up on the scene, which is why he treated Judea and Jerusalem so kindly. Okay, world leaders understood that the scriptures of the Jews were very powerful and prophetic. And so Daniel becomes the chief of the Magi. And he made sure that they were ready to be in place when the Messiah was finally born. When they showed up in Jerusalem, they said, where's the one who's been born King of the Jews? I don't think he could have said anything that would have been more like a poke right between the ribs. Okay. Herod was appointed King of the Jews. He wasn't even Jewish. He was Idumean. These were I won't even get into the whole story of that. But anyway, he wasn't liked for his heritage, and he wasn't Jewish, and he was a king appointed by Caesar, and now they show up in Jerusalem and said, hey, where's the guy that was just born king? Not born to be king. He was born king. Boy, if you wanted to have Herod flip, that's what you would say. And they could do it with impunity because they were heads of state from Parthia, and Herod certainly wasn't going to start a war over it, one that Rome would be very upset about and probably depose him, because Rome only wanted to fight the wars it could win. And it had enough territory to go after without Herod starting something. He had to deal with skirmishes. He had to drive them out when he got there, but keep the peace at all costs. And so they come into town and they do this. Where's the one born King of the Jews? And so it was an insult. They were acknowledging the true king in Jerusalem, which, by the way, would upset. There's always were plots against the man. He was paranoid anyway. And so this would not be something that made him happy. It says, we saw his star when it rose and we came to worship him. Now, I know translations are 50-50, honestly, on whether you say we saw his star in the east or we saw it when it rose. Obviously, you know which side I, as a translator, came down on, because it makes much more sense. They came from the east. And so we saw his star in the east? No. We saw his star when it rose. It can mean either. It makes much more sense to say that they saw the star when it appeared. And so when they saw the star appear, they knew what it meant. And here's one of the scriptures that may have helped them. Numbers 24:17, a prophecy of Balaam. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come from Jacob. A scepter will rise from Israel. He will strike Moab's head and tear down all the sons of Sheth. A star will come from Jacob. Okay? So this could be one of the scriptures that the Magi had, saying when the Messiah comes, there's going to be a star that heralds him. What was that star? Theories, it's not the conjunction of planets. There just wasn't, they never got close enough. And, it'd be very hard for a conjunction of planets to point to the very house that Mary and Joseph were in. Okay? Some people say maybe it was a supernova that suddenly appeared in the sky. That may have been the initial sign, but the sign that got them to the house itself was, of course, something that was far more supernatural. And but whatever it was, they understood this was the sign that had been prophesied, that had been foretold about what was going to come about when the Messiah was born in Israel, the King of Kings. So they start on their journey, and they get there months, probably 6, 12 months. Now it says, when Herod the king heard it, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had gathered all the chief priests and scribal scholars of the people, he subjected them to an examination about where the Christ would be born. So Herod, here's what's going on, and he was a ruthless man. How ruthless was Herod? When he was on his deathbed, he gathered 100 of Jerusalem's leading citizens, and he had them put in an amphitheater. And the order was, when I die, kill them all, because I need people to be grieving in Jerusalem when I die. Okay, now fortunately that order was not followed. But that was who Herod was. Herod the ruthless. He just did not want to have Jerusalem being happy when he died, and so he set it up so that Jerusalem wouldn't be happy. 100 of the leading citizens. That's ruthless. Talk about a low value on life. So you can understand when Herod's troubled, all of Jerusalem is troubled too. Okay, it just is. Because why? Because he was a mean, ruthless, ugly man. And that means if he's upset, you just don't know what he's going to do. We know what he did. He killed a lot of kids eventually in his quest to stop this newborn king. He took the word seriously from the Magi. He understood about the Messiah, by the way. He was well aware of the Messiah. There was always messianic pretenders, and that was just something that was common in Israel, especially around this time, at the turn of the millennia. So, all Jerusalem was upset with him, and so he got together two specific teams. He gathered the chief priests. Now, by the way, the word chief priest should not be in the plural. There was a chief priest. There was a high priest, we usually say. However, Rome got in the habit of deposing the ones they didn't like and appointing a new high priest. And so, for instance, in the time of Jesus, when he was being tried, after he got arrested in the garden, it says he first went to Annas. Annas wasn't the high priest anymore, but he had been deposed, and it had been given to his son-in-law, Caiaphas. So now you've got this thing where there's two high priests. One of them not recognized in the eyes of Rome, one of them recognized in the eyes of Rome, and they both functioned together in whatever way, complementary way that they could. And so you had this really an abomination in what God had planned, where there were two chief priests or high priests. And I don't know how many there were at this time. Herod could have been bouncing them around forever because it was easy to get on Herod's bad side. The trouble is, when you got on Herod's bad side, you probably didn't live that long, so maybe he was nicer to the high priests. But so it gathered together the chief priests. These were the guys that used to be the high priests, could have also referred to the higher level priests in Jerusalem, included with them. And then it also gathered together all the scribal scholars. Now, I'm the one that calls them scribal scholars. Some people call them lawyers. Some people call them scribes. They were scholars who were also legal experts, and they would copy the scriptures. I think scribal scholars is a pretty good description. They were scribes and they were scholars. And anyway, so they gathered those guys. So he's thinking, between the two groups, I'm going to get an answer. And he asks them. Now, when they're asked, they want to come up with an answer. But it wasn't that difficult for them, because this for them was like, this is easy, okay? We understand this question. And so it says, then they explained to him in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written through the prophet, and you, Bethlehem of the region of Judea, you are by no means the least among the princes of Judea, for from you will come a prince who will shepherd my people Israel. That's about as clear as you can get from the book of Micah. And so they said, hey, we've got an answer. It's Bethlehem, house of bread. By the way, I've originally referred to a store city, like a granary. Okay, I mean, just that's where they stored their grain. And so it was called Bethlehem. And there was a Bethlehem in the north, too, which is why they had to say Bethlehem of Judea, because there was a Bethlehem of Galilee, too. So they had to make sure that they got it focused. It was written through the prophet. Sometimes translations drop that through, and they just said, as the prophet says. This is very clearly, it was written through the prophet. It isn't the prophet saying this. It's what God said through him. And that's a little bit of a difference, but it really speaks about the scriptural view of how inspired scripture came. Holy men of God spoke as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit, we're told in Peter. And these guys were carried along by the Holy Spirit. The one that's really interesting to me is the one that says, even the prophets of old looked into what they were writing, trying to determine what it meant. They're writing this stuff, and they had the same issue we have. They're trying to interpret its meaning, even as they're the ones that wrote it down. That tells you that it wasn't their creativity that was releasing these scriptures. It means that God was speaking through them. So the prophet was Micah. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are trifling among the tribes of Judah, from you one will go out for me to be a ruler in Israel. His origins are from long ago, from the eternal ages. So you can tell that they didn't quite give a totally accurate quote. They kind of put together a couple other scriptures as they were responding, but they got the gist of Micah 5:2. And they said, hey, it's Bethlehem, because the prophet said it's going to be in Bethlehem. And so they said he will be a prince. He will be the one who is royalty. Now, what Herod was hearing through all of this is that one of the royal line of David was now on the scene again. And the last thing that an appointed king wants to hear as he's leading in Israel is that one of the royal line is about to show his face, because that's going to be someone who's going to be hard to stop. He understood that. And so he needed to stop him very quickly. So what did he do? Then when Herod had secretly summoned the Magi, he ascertained from them the exact time the star started to shine. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and carefully find out about the child. Then when you have found out, report to me so that I also may come and worship him. It's kind of like, if you've seen an alligator cartoon and the alligator said, I just want to give, to a little animal, I just want to lean over and give you a kiss. Okay. That's Herod. The only thing he ever worshipped was himself. So anyway, or his kingship. He would do anything to support the fact that he'd stay as a king. So Herod secretly reached out to the Magi. Whatever reason it was secret. He probably didn't want people to know he was even interested. His plan was, I'm going to get rid of this usurper, and I can't let the usurper know that I'm doing this, or his parents, or his, the family around him. And so I don't want to. It's probably the same reason he didn't send any troops with the Magi. If he had sent troops with the Magi, people would have clammed up. They wouldn't talk to Herod and his troops. They knew better. Herod's asking about something, you didn't want to share anything, because it would be not in your best interest or anybody else's to be able to share with Herod and his troops. They were vicious. So he got the Magi in. He didn't let anyone know he was interested. That's why it was secretly. Didn't want the word to get out. Herod's turning his attention to this report, because that way the family could flee, and then how would he be able to kill all those children? Okay. So he figured the timing. He's already plotting. Oh, by the way, how old would he be about now? Oh, yeah, he was born then. Well, wow, that's interesting. That's when you saw the star, because he understood it's when the star appeared that's when the Messiah was born. So when did that star that you saw appear? And so then he sent them as his representatives. That's very interesting. They bought what he was saying, hook, line, and sinker. They didn't know much about him. Okay, they didn't realize that he had a different purpose. If God had not intervened, they probably would have been used for evil. But their intent wasn't evil. But God intervened. Always ask God to intervene. If you're about to be used for something which is evil and you don't know it, always ask God to intervene. Speak to you. Cut it off somehow, in a way that's not so traumatic. But ask him to cut it off, because you don't want to be used to release something evil. I mean, if all of a sudden someone's asking you a question and you naively do not know, they're just trying to gather information on someone else so they can harm them, hurt their reputation, impair their ability to have influence in some area of their life, you need a little alarm bell to go off in your head. Ding, 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 ding. Don't share this information. Have the Lord, just suddenly have horns grow out of their head, at least in a vision. Whatever you need to have the discernment at that time to know this is not right. And so you're not used for evil. He wanted to use them unknowingly to release great evil. Just by asking the question, all those kids in Bethlehem were killed. That's because they asked a question about where the king was born. And Herod killed all of them. So, Herod's worship, he certainly wasn't going to worship. His worship was going to send his troops and make sure that this threat to his royal kingdom was removed. I don't know how long Herod thought he was going to reign. I mean, again, he knew his family had a chance to be appointed as king. Turns out they weren't. He did have one son who was removed very quickly, and that's when they came to the tetrarchs. So, but anyway, so he was protecting the royal line too. His royal line. When they had heard the king, the Magi heard the king, they journeyed on. Suddenly the star which they had seen when it rose led them until it stood over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with overwhelming joy. Okay, this lets you know that at least now the star is something else. Okay, it may have appeared in the same way it originally appeared to them, and they saw it, but this one led them where they were supposed to go. They didn't need to be led to Bethlehem. Bethlehem was on the main road between Jerusalem and Hebron to the south. And that road, you stayed on the main road. When they left Jerusalem, they were told, just stay on the main road, you'll get right to Bethlehem. It's only like a couple miles. I mean, this isn't like hard. And so they got on the road and they headed south. They didn't need a guide to Bethlehem. They needed a guide to the house. And people were notoriously tight-lipped about anything, because they weren't going to help Herod or anyone that could be perceived as someone who might tell Herod what was going on in their community. You just didn't risk that. And so they needed to have some extraordinary input from the Lord so they would know where this newborn king was living. Understand, in that era, there were kids everywhere. They had lots and lots of kids running around in that village. And that was just the way it was. Lots of them the same age, because people were having kids all the time. If you study the Jewish purification rituals, you understand that the Lord set it up through their purification rituals that husbands and wives needed to be separate until just the time that the wife was at her most fertile. And that's when they could have intimacy again. Do you know how many kids that created? Okay. Because there would be a long period of time of no touchy. And then all of a sudden, Oh, now we can, and yet it's the wife's most fertile time, which means the Lord set it up so that Israel would continue to expand at a very, very high rate. So that is just the way it was. So there are lots of kids kicking around Bethlehem. If you did not have divine leading, you were not going to find the child that you were looking for, and they weren't going to tell you, okay? So they took off looking for the prince, and the star reappears. There's some kind of, like I said, supernatural thing, leads them directly to the house, which is pretty incredible. They got to the house. Mary and Joseph had lived there for quite some time. The other thing that that when they saw the star, it led them right till it stood over the place where the child was, and it says they were overwhelmed with joy. Can you imagine? They understood that the God of the universe was leading them. By the way, you shouldn't be able to, that shouldn't be something for you difficult to imagine, because there are times in our lives when God makes his direction in our lives so obvious, we would be dense if we didn't see it. And whenever he does that, you got to celebrate. You got to say, thank you, Lord. You are intervening in my life. You know, when I told you about the, if you want to go over the fence into 2026, you'll still find blessing. But if you enter through the gate, you're going to have a river of, he was giving us direction. You know how profound that is? He could have just let us go our own way, but he's saying, hey, it's important for you. This is him saying, I want a river of provision to follow you in 2026, and I'm going to tell you how to unleash it. That's the God of the universe caring enough about us to make certain that we understand how to step into what he is doing in our lives. And when you see it come to fruition, then you're really impacted, because you say, the Lord is following through on his promise. And that's powerful. So they were overwhelmed with joy. When they came into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and brought him gifts of gold, incense, and myrrh. Okay, here's another historical accuracy of our scene. It says they went into the house. However, if we put them in the house, you wouldn't see them. So Scott and I were talking before the meeting, and we decided that this was the next day while they were enjoying coffee together. Talk about anachronism, right? Coffee, tea, maybe some kind of hot beverage with, gunk in it. But so this is their farewell. They spent the night, maybe spent a couple days, and then they decided, okay, it's time to go. I don't think they spent much time. I think they got on the move, especially because the Lord warned them. So, but this is the outside time after they got there. But they went into the house and they presented him with the gifts. So while they're in the house, they saw Mary and the child. What about Joseph? Well, of course, Joseph was in the house. He just isn't mentioned because the focus was on Mary and the child right now. And Joseph was over on the side saying, "What am I, chopped liver?" So they saw Mary, and they bowed down to worship him. They probably got flat down right in front of him. I mean, it's Oriental worship, flat on the face homage, and or homage. So so they got down. They gave him gifts of gold, incense, and myrrh. Traditionally, the incense is translated frankincense. It ties it into some of the other scriptures about whole messages are preached on each of these gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And they may even be accurate. Who knows? So, but it was amazing gifts. By the way, we know at the naming of Jesus that they gave the poor. They gave the offering, or you could when the child was presented at the temple, there were two different offerings that could be given. One if you were wealthy, one if you were poor. Mary and Joseph gave the poor offering, meaning they gave the pigeon offering, not the sheep offering. And as a result, we know Mary and Joseph didn't have a lot of resources when they first got to Bethlehem. Now they're going to be called on to flee to Egypt with no resources. Well, they didn't have resources, but they were just given the resource that they needed to be able to go. This is what paid their way to Egypt. when they had to flee. They had resources so that they were able then to be able to, go to Egypt, have the provision they needed to live there, even if he couldn't find work, and then have the provision to come back and then set up his business again in Nazareth. So amazing gifts, but amazing. God set up the provision. He paid for the trip to Egypt because he's the provider God. He can do these things. Because they were warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they went back to their own country by a different route. This really annoyed Herod. Okay, we won't get into that today, but it annoyed Herod. They had a dream warning. If you realize how important dreams are throughout the scriptures, you'd realize they're important now. Okay, capture your dreams. We all have times where dreams are really super vivid and we can remember them, but make it a habit to journal your dreams, because even the vivid ones you will lose if you don't write them down in the morning when you first get up. Sometimes when a dream's vivid enough, I get up to, or if I wake up and I realize it's significant, I'll just make sure I speak it into my voice recorder, which I always keep right by the bed. See, that makes sure I don't have to get up, open a computer screen. I used to do that, type it all out. I was in Bulgaria once as a part of a ministry team, and all the guys that were on the team, there were 3 of us, all slept in the living room on couches, okay? And in the morning, after we slept there the first night, Julian Richards, who now leads New Wine Cymru, which is the largest ministry stream in Wales, looks at me and says, "Do you know how many times you were up overnight typing on your computer? How many dreams did you have?" Now, it wouldn't have been much better if I would have been speaking into a voice recorder, you understand? I mean, it's a horse apiece. But he had been awakened and up overnight that he let me know. He did not always appreciate it. I said, "Do you want the word?" And of course he did. But okay, dreams are everywhere. Okay, and in the scripture, and we need to realize God still speaks. These were magi; they were not Jewish people, and God spoke to them. He spoke to Joseph, not Joseph of the Old Testament, Joseph, Mary's husband. He made sure that he spoke to him in dreams. He'll be speaking to Joseph again, a warning about what Herod was about to do, so he would take off. And then he was told, "Hey, you can come back. Archelaus is ruling instead of his dad, so you can come back." Well, you can come back because Herod's dead. And then he comes back and he hears about Archelaus, and he's warned again, and he goes up to Nazareth instead of hanging around where people might say, "Hey, that baby you were looking for? He's back." So they have a dream warning, and so Herod's exposed. He had acted, "Hey, I want to come worship him," and in a dream they're told, "No, this isn't good." And so they needed to avoid Herod. Told you I'd show you a map by the end. Notice how close Jerusalem and Bethlehem are in the center of the screen. The main highway, north-south, went through Jerusalem, through Bethlehem, and down to Hebron. Once you got to Hebron, you could go west or you could go east, okay? If you went up through Jerusalem, well, you wouldn't go back up. But when you're a magi and you're told, avoid Herod, you don't go north. Now you're headed south. And so they would head south. They had to head, the main road went down to Hebron, unless they took a side road, which would not be advisable. I told you I'd show you the fortresses. Do you see them all? If you look at the top of the screen, Alexandrium, then you look at Cyprus, Hyrcania, Herodium, Masada, Malatha. There's Machaerus over there. They were set up for the danger from the east, which was the Parthians. Now look at all the fortresses on the left, to the west side. Not one. That's Rome. They were their allies. They did not have fortresses. It was all to protect against any problems with the Parthians, which is why when the Parthians showed up, it was a problem. So now you've got they said, well, we got to go a different route. So they probably just went down to Hebron, and then they may have gone over to the western road and went north, or they could have come over to the King's Highway, which is east of the Dead Sea. They would have had to come down, though, through some fortresses, and they probably would have avoided that. You don't want to be anywhere where Herod had the ability to communicate with people. And so unless they were really ahead of Herod, in which they couldn't be guaranteed. So more than likely they went west and went north, avoiding the fortresses of of Herod so that they were able to get out of town without him stopping them and causing them problems. Remember, they're a retinue and a force in and of themselves, but they still did not want to cause issues because Herod could have been crazy and hoped to kill them all, exterminate them, question some, and then get rid of them, and no one would ever know what happened to them back home. That's just how evil murderers think. Okay, so that is the story of how the Magi acknowledged the king, how the God of the universe acknowledged that the king was born by putting a star in the sky that the Magi understood because Daniel had trained them to understand the signs that would be built in around the birth of Messiah, the King of Kings. That's amazing. And that same God is guiding and directing our lives. You know, right now, the people that were living at that time, they're part of the great cloud of witnesses, and they're looking down now to see what is going on in the world. And the times in which we are living are, some of those saints are thinking, boy, I wish I could have lived now. Because these are times that are critical. And God's going to use us as his people in 2026. God's going to use his people in 2026 and 2027. This is a time of great change. And there's going to be some very difficult things unleashed on the earth. The darkness is going to get darker, but guess what? God's people are going to get brighter. And there's going to be some things coming that are we have to keep our eyes on Jesus, because if we don't, we'll get scared. And if we do, it's not even going to be a bump in the road. Only fear will take us out. Don't let yourself give in to fear. You know, the Magi didn't give in to fear. They just said, let's take a different way. We'll avoid this monstrous man now that we've been told about him. Anyway, let's pray. Lord, I thank you for this opportunity that we've had today to study about the Magi once again. And Gentile Christmas, the birth of Gentile Christmas, we thank you that from the very beginning it's obvious that you were going to reach beyond the Jewish people. Even in the prophetic scriptures it was clear. You were always planning on reaching beyond the Jewish people and reaching out to the Gentiles. And most of us in this room are Gentiles, and we thank you for the fact that you show very clearly your great love for all people. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen.